Coming up on River City Presents, we're going to be discussing Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation with Murray State professor Dr. Kevin Elliott. Welcome to River City Presents. I'm Daniel Hurt. Martin Luther is often seen as an icon of the Christian movement, especially with his 95 Theses in 1517. But how iconic was he? That's an interesting question. Joining me to discuss it on the program is Murray State Professor of Political Science, Dr. Kevin Elliott, who just recently will start a teaching position this fall at Yale University. Welcome to the show, Dr. Elliott.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you here. I actually had you as a professor at Murray State, and if you would just start by giving us your educational background and how you got to Murray.
Sure, yeah. So I'm originally from California, and went to public schools in the San Francisco Bay Area, and went to undergrad at UCLA. After that, I had the idea of becoming a professor introduced to me at that time, but was not really, introduced to me in the shape of this is something you want to think about very carefully. It's not a great prospect for this type of thing. So I went for a couple of years working and trying to find a way to do anything other than that and be happy with it, and turns out I couldn't. So I went and got a master's degree at the London School of Economics and Political Theory, and then to Columbia to get my PhD.
I graduated much later from Murray State than probably the traditional route was, but I will say your class, your 461 political theory class, was my favorite course I ever took at Murray State.
Thank you very much.
But to get started, so Martin Luther, I guess we should start at the beginning and say something that shouldn't be controversial but might be. Jesus Christ was not a Christian. He was Jewish who wanted to reform Judaism. Is that right? Is that
something like that? Something like that. Certainly, what we will call Christianity takes several hundred years to emerge. It's really initially after Jesus' death and so forth. You have a period where you have something like that. There's something that theologians and people study sort of this period. The Jesus movement is sort of what it's termed, and this is a movement inside Judaism. One of the biggest questions in the early Christian movement is whether non-Jews can be Christians, can be followers of Jesus. And so you have this debate, which is ultimately, I don't know to say answered, but the figure of Paul, who is popularly known as the apostle to the Gentiles, right? The whole point is he brings the message of Jesus, the Jesus story, to Greeks, which is to say anyone who's not Jewish, right? Basically Greek-speaking people in the Eastern Mediterranean at the time. And this really leads to the sprouting of what will eventually become what we recognize as Christianity.
So sort of went from when I say this in invoking the term of the era, sort of a cult of Jesus Christ.
Indeed.
Into a larger, legit organization.
Right, into these, you have Paul and figures like him traveling to different cities and like seeds, right? He's planting these communities. He's helping found these these sort of cult communities who become organized around practices of preaching and devotional practices and shared devotional practices. And in the ancient world, the world of antiquity, this is totally fine because you have new cults popping up all the time.
It wasn't just his.
It wasn't just exactly. You'll have every city will have a cult of Jupiter and a cult of this and a cult of that and a cult of the unconquered sun, and all these types of things are a part of the everyday life. And so then you've got this new one. Well, this charismatic preacher from the Near East, and here's this whole story about it. How does that sound to you? Oh, it sounds pretty interesting. Let's go check this out.
So he sort of wins out over all the other factions, so to speak. His voice sort of becomes loudest of all these.
In terms of, it does take quite a long time, right? There's a long history of conflict within the Roman world over the place of the church. You do have periods of intense persecution of the Christians, of course.
And it's the disciples and followers of Christ that ended up founding the church.
Precisely.
And Paul also, one could argue, is the most important figure, and I set this up for Luther because he's the most important figure to Christianity besides Christ in terms of the early years, right?
Precisely. In terms of if you want to identify someone as the founder of Christianity, Paul is actually a better candidate than Christ, precisely as you say.
And this church looks a lot different than what would ultimately become of the days of Luther, right? So how is it more tribal in nature in comparison, or how would you describe the early church compared to 1517?
So the church is much more ecumenical, or I shouldn't say ecumenical, but rather sort of multipolar, right? So in the early church, you've got of course, you know, to use a little bit of jargon here, the question of what's called ecclesiastical polity, which is to say the structure of the church. How will the church be organized is one of these things that gets fought out over the first, in the first several centuries, really. We're talking about the first 200-300 years of the sort of Christian movement. The question of how the church will be organized is one of these central questions that divides the Christian movement internally. So you have these communities sort of planted all across in all the different communities of the Roman world. But how will they be organized? Will they, above all, you know, will they be hierarchical in structure? You know, will heads of churches be subservient to someone else? Turns out the answer is yes. Those figures are called bishops, and those bishops are where we get the word. I believe it's in Greek. They're called the episcopate, right? And so the episcopal structure of the church emerges with bishops. But in this early period, you'll have bishops of some of the principal cities of the empire will be preeminent in their region. So the Bishop of Alexandria in northern Africa will be a very important figure, a co-equal figure for some period of time to the Bishop of Rome, the Bishop of Constantinople, the Bishop of Antioch. These will be preeminent figures in their region, and none of them were initially preeminent.
So they're sort of decentralized.
Yes, exactly. Sort of think of it more like multipolar. Right, so each one of them would have a degree of preeminence in their region, and then eventually you have the fracturing of the church into East and West. You have the conquest of northern Africa and the Near East by the expanding Islamic empire, and this kind of reduces the number of holes, as it were, in the Christian world.
And that ultimately leads to the Bishop of Rome becoming the Pope, as they say.
The preeminent figure of the Western Church, precisely.
And what is his role? What is his role with the church exactly?
So the church is, again, so come back to this term of ecclesiastical polity. You know, churches are communities, and they have questions that need to be settled. And the question of how questions will be settled, this is a question of organization. Who's going to have a say? What will the process be? And it takes quite a while and there's quite a lot of disagreement regarding how those questions will be answered. That is to say, theological questions, but also questions about who will appoint bishops, these types of things.
Sort of the political hierarchy within the church.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes, exactly. Power within the church, power within the organization itself. And so, you know, over a long period of time, eventually you do have the consolidation of power in the hands of the Pope. And then, of course, there come the intersection of what we will eventually call, anachronistically in this period, ecclesiastical authority with the power of the secular authority. Right. So the question of who will appoint bishops is one of these questions that will have kings will have something to say about who the bishop is in their kingdom, for instance.
Almost, the divine right starting to...
well, the question of these bishops are in my land, you should take my recommendation.
I see.
This will be very much the case in the Kingdom of France, right? So the French kings will very much want to have something to say. So they will recognize the bishops, the Pope's authority to appoint bishops, and then there's just kind of like an implicit deal that the French kings will have maybe say over who they are. will nominate, right? Send the nomination to the Pope, and the Pope will say, I say it's this person as well.
Right.
It's not because you said it, King of France, it's because I said it that makes him bishop. But we've just worked out a deal and understanding.
And that relationship and all those factors, as well as others, is what leads to some of the Luther-like figures asking for reform. So if you would sort of set the stage, why is Luther now taking to paper? Because when you write something down, you're formalizing it. So what has happened that has gotten so bad in his mind within the church that is deserving of reform?
Well, as you say, you do have previous efforts at reform during in the period before, in the High Middle Ages and the later Middle Ages. So we're talking about the around 1500, right? 1500 is a hinge point in history, and this is why my course, Ancient and Medieval Political Thought, ends around 1500 with two figures, Luther and Machiavelli, who are definitely according to me, right, sort of on my view, medieval figures, but they are also interestingly sort of liminal. They are maybe midwives of a change that is going to mark a very big change, the very big changes that are going to be happening in Europe, and not only in Europe, of course, over the next couple of centuries, because what's happening at this time, you have to remember there's multiple things happening all at the same time. Of course, we've got the moment of contact between the European world and the New World. This creates an enormous new set of issues and opportunities for European rulers to project power. You also have the not circumnavigation, but rather the opening up of trade with China and India and the East Indies, with the Portuguese figuring out how to sail around the tip of Africa, right? And you also have at the same time Luther, who is writing around 1500, it's in the years after 1500, opening up a new front of political contestation in Europe proper, and this is precisely in this realm of religion. So a lot of things are happening at once, and you have Luther contributing to a change that other people have tried to get going. And for a variety of reasons, in large part, we're talking about luck, right? Other reformers have tried to move forward with complaints not dissimilar to the ones that he is going to be complaining about. And they had the bad luck to be under kings or other secular rulers who were not prepared to cross the Bishop of Rome by allowing the message of a heretic to spread from their domain, not interested in protecting him or him always. And Luther found himself in a position of having a supportive, basically secular ruler, someone who's willing to protect him against other forces. It's lucky that he's German. Here, one of the things that we forget in the modern period is when we speak of Germany, in this period, really in any time before 1870, Germany is a geographic phenomenon, not a political one. Right? So you've got just a crazy quilt of little bishoprics and principalities and marquisates and all of these. I mean, look at a map of Germany in this period. It's this crazy quilt of little tiny, sometimes city-states, and then vast kingdoms like Prussia or Bavaria. And so the multiplicity of political entities that you have creates this opportunity for, not to say that Luther did this, but you can have people escape from one principality to another, right, from an unfriendly ruler.
If you're in danger.
Precisely.
Because speaking out against the church is politically and physically dangerous for you.
Precisely. But you can move from one political entity to another that has a different relationship with the church, with the Catholic Church.
I see.
But also another figure that's important here is the Holy Roman Emperor, who, although you have this crazy quilt of German states, most of them, vast majority of them, are nominally underneath some people call him the German Emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, who is not an emperor in the way that we think of like a Roman emperor as having like, sort of plenary power to just kind of enforce his will. He's constrained in all sorts of really interesting ways. His authority over each one of those little individual principalities and is special and unique and different. We call this kind of political system, which is highly personalistic, highly particularistic,
and
chaotic. Well, it can be chaotic again from the perspective of today, right?
Yeah.
Chaotic in the sense of like, well, what is the law? Well, where are you living, right?
Yeah.
Who is your ruler? These types of the particularity of these types of relationships are what we call feudalism, right? Where we're talking about the feudal period.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that's going to get going in 1500 on the European stage is a very long period of centralization of power. You're going to have more and more power centralized in larger and larger states, larger and larger political entities.
National boundaries.
Precisely,
Yeah.
yes. Now, nationalism is going to take a long time to kind of what we will eventually call national boundaries. It's going to take a long time for nationalism to get going, but you are seeing now not so much the rise of nationalism, but think of it as the strengthening of monarchs, the strengthening of rulers.
Your King Louis are starting to bounce up. And
they're starting to gain the ability to organize resources, to borrow money becomes a big thing because kings love nothing more than to fight wars. And in order to fight wars, you need a strong state. And in order to, and part of when we say a strong state, what we mean are, do you have bureaucrats whose job it is to write the decrees and gather the taxes and administer the provisioning of your armies, right? These are all jobs. And in order to get these jobs done, you need people to work for you. And in order to get them to work for you, you need to gather resources.
Right.
And the ability to do all those things is what early modern states are going to be building the ability to do, the capacity to do.
So with Luther, is his concern this relationship between like monarchs and the church and the power that the monarchs have, or the power that the church may have over the monarchs, or vice versa?
Yes, so one of the key questions that's going to be emerging in this period is the relationship between the institutional church and, again, as we call them, sort of secular authorities. Now, again, the idea that there is a difference in these two spheres of authority, that is an idea that is being invented in this period, and Luther is going to be one of the people who's contributing to it.
Okay.
Contestation over the scope of the Pope's authority and the scope of the authority of someone like the King of France or whatever, the Marquis of Bavaria or whatever, Duke of Bavaria. That itself has been contested for a long time and is going to be different from place to place. As I mentioned, the kings of France will have a special authority over the appointment of, for instance, bishops, but the King of Prussia will not have that same authority necessarily because, again, things are different from place to place.
So what does he say in the theses?
So one of the big bones of contention is going to, for Luther early on. He is concerned about corruption in the church, and that corruption takes a whole bunch of different forms. It has to do with people becoming priests and bishops who are not churchmen at all. They'll be the sons of dukes. They'll be the sons of bishops. And the reason that they, not bishops, pardon me, like barons
political
and kings.
appointees within the church.
Precisely. People whose position is primarily political in the sense of, well, the whole point here is that the church and the state were deeply interpenetrated during this period of time, and this was one of the many sources of corruption that Luther was concerned about. Another thing that he was concerned about had to do with, one of the most famous kind of complaints here would have to do with the practice of indulgence. Yeah. Previous reformers had complained about, so an indulgence, for those
it's like a blank check, sort of, right?
Well, yes, but a blank check for getting out of not hell, but rather purgatory. Purgatory being this place that after you die, you spend some time in purgatory being purified in order to be able to ascend to heaven. Earlier reformers, and Luther shared this, complained that purgatory has no biblical basis whatsoever. It's just made up, and made up by whom? By the church, right? By the church itself.
As a means of revenue building.
As a means of enhancing their own role and being pressed into the use, raising money for the church, for building projects. When we talk about the church raising money, a lot of what they're doing with this money is building, the cathedrals that we see. If you go to Europe, you see images of these old European city squares. You'll see these gorgeous.
But that's spreading their empire around the world.
Absolutely, right? Because those giant building projects are themselves projects of power. Because in order to build a giant thing like that, you are paying all the stonemasons and all of the local people. It's a driver of the local economy, you might say today, right? And when the church is the one directing those resources, that's a source of immense power for church officials.
I did this for you, so you might even be more inclined to worship my God, for example, if you didn't.
Precisely, and also bear in mind that the building of these cathedrals goes on for hundreds of years in many cases. And so if you think about the scope think about what that means for the power relations inside those communities. For hundreds of years, you have the church directing massive amounts of resources to people in the community. That makes members of the church, that makes the church hierarchy lords in their own right.
So while there's corruption going on and while there's indulgences, there's actually an economic benefit to this too. So it's sort of a double-edged sword, so to speak. The church might say, well, yeah, you don't like the way we're running things, but we're also putting you to work, and your family's got a good economy because of it, so to speak.
And so that that itself is, in Luther's eyes, not what the church is supposed to be doing.
Right.
The church is not supposed to be concerned with these types of things. Not to say you shouldn't be building churches. That's not really the point, but rather, right, the point that
this focus on survival, the economy,
and economic concerns. Yeah. Should the church be concerned about raising money? Should this be one of the things that priests are doing? Should the church be overwhelmingly concerned with maintaining doctrines which have no scriptural basis, but that make it easier to raise money?
I suppose the way I think of it is is it fair to say that he's sort of one of those that's like, you will suffer here, you give to the state whatever it wants, but your reward's actually in heaven. So is that?
Yeah, it'd be something like, so Luther will articulate that there is a distinct job for the state and a distinct job for the church. The church's job is to preach the word. That's it, full stop, nothing more than that. The evangel, right? So you've heard of an evangelical church, right?
Sure.
The evangel is the word. For Luther, that is the job of the church. That is not the job of the state. The job of the state is distinct. The job of the secular ruler is to secure peace. Stability and peace, because in peace the church can preach the word, right,
uninterrupted.
Exactly. Yeah. When you've got disorder and so forth, no one's going to church. They're like trying to protect themselves from whatever rapine or the armies marching through. You're not having orderly church services in that circumstance. So for Luther, the job of the church and the job of the state are complementary. Right. Okay. So it is the job of the job of the state is important, but it's not. But it is distinct from that of the church, and it is, you might think of it as sort of like a precondition of the proper Christian church's function. You might say something like that.
So what does he think the relationship of the individual Christian should be with government or the secular authority?
Indeed, obedience, obey.
Complete.
Pretty much, pretty much, very, very far. Yes, he says the limits. What do the limits look like? He's very clear. He says one of his famous passages, one of his famous slogans. He says, "Thoughts are tax-free."
What does that mean?
Yeah, by which he means that if a secular ruler tries to tell you to believe a particular type of thing, well, then he goes beyond his authority, because no law can bind your conscience. Your conscience is entirely free from any kind of coercive power. And so for that reason, if a secular ruler tries to tell you to believe something, it's just impossible. He can't actually do it, right? Your thoughts
and that's that distinctness between the church, too, and the secular authority. It's separate, so don't worry about it.
Exactly. The church cannot actually, the secular authority cannot exercise authority in this space. So if he tries, it's just beyond his ability to do so. Now, that being said, he does then say, so if a ruler tries to tell you to believe something, you don't have to, because, he can't actually do that. And if he tries to tell you to, like, get rid of certain kinds of books, which he seems to assume is just a straightforward extension of the freedom of thought. He says, well, you don't have to obey that either.
So books are an extension of your intellectual freedom in his mind.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Now, he is an enormously prolific writer. I think one of the other things that is important for marking out Luther compared to other reformers, both before and after, is his enormous prolific production. His complete works are something like 100 volumes.
Oh, wow.
He is just pouring forth from his pen thousands and thousands of words every month, and this adds up to an enormous corpus of work. So you can find him saying all sorts of things.
If the secular authority told you to practice a different religion, would that be violation, or do you do that too?
You would do that as well. You would not.
Okay.
Yes, because that would not be your.
So still practice your Christianity in secret.
Absolutely.
But if they say you're a Hindu now, for example.
Yes, and if he says you need to give money to the temple, if he says you need to attend Islamic service, something like that. Now he doesn't say. So this is a little bit. He is not as explicit on this. Well, what if you live under a Muslim ruler?
Yeah.
But he does seem to be pretty clear that if you are under a godless, let's say, like a non-Christian, and by this he would mean someone who doesn't abide by his interpretation of Christianity, right? That you should nonetheless obey the secular authority because they're doing an important job. And your obedience to the secular ruler is in fact a part of your Christian duty, and this is a very interesting part of his doctrine, because he says the thing about Christians is there's not a lot of them. The world is mostly non-Christians, even in Christendom, right? He's talking about Christian lands.
They're not real Christians.
They're not real Christians because only a few are going to be saved. Now, what's interesting about that?
That's pretty exclusive.
It is. He has a very highly exclusionary view of who's actually going to be a Christian, and for that reason, he thinks for most people living under even Christian rulers or ostensibly Christian rulers, they are actually mostly ruling over non-Christians. Now, for Christians, obeying the law, that is to say, like not hurting each other and all that type of thing, that comes automatically for Christians because they're, for a variety of reasons, we could talk about this if you'd like, but they are not the problem. Non-Christians are the problem. The secular law, the law of the ruler, is there to make sure that they don't hurt each other, rob each other, kill each other, and so forth. Yeah. And that's important. Not because that's what's most important in the world, right? The most important thing in the world is salvation. But for people who are not Christians, there is a dictate in the Bible. Love your neighbor. Now, your neighbor is not a Christian.
No, that's right.
And so, the job of the state is to provide the things that your neighbor needs for survival. And so, so obedience to the state, Luther interprets as a form of obeying the dictate of loving your neighbor. You obey the state because the state secures for your neighbor peace and order.
That's very interesting, and like when I think of modern context of like when Americans tend to not want to follow secular law, Luther would be completely opposed to dare I get controversial and say like a mask mandate or something, it would be your duty as a Christian to do that,
yes,
according to Luther.
Precisely, because even if you don't need to be told to do the right thing as a Christian, the law isn't something that you need to be constrained to obey. Your neighbor does, and those laws are to your neighbor's benefit, and you are enjoined, right, as a Christian, to love your neighbor. This goes so far as to say, he asks this provocative question, can a Christian be a hangman?
Yeah.
And he says, yes.
For the secular authority.
For the secular authority,
right.
Yes. An executioner for the state, which you would think, how can you call cutting someone's head off or dropping someone from a noose, right? How could that possibly be something a Christian could do? And he says, well, the secular authority needs executioners.
It's your Christian duty to...
It may be. He doesn't say you would have to, but like he says that like you need to do what you need. You need to assist the secular authority.
If they need your help, you must fulfill it.
Precisely. If they need your help, it is part of your duty as a Christian to do so, and that might include you cutting off a few heads.
Does that also include serving in public office or in public position? So would he say that a Christian should run for office?
So running for office, right, at that time, you didn't really have elective offices in the way that we think of today.
Petition to be in position.
Yeah, so seeking those kinds of, those types of positions of authority would have been sufficiently closed that the question would not really have occurred to him in quite the way that we might think of today in terms of like, should a Christian occupy public office? It would nonetheless be, you could extend this line of argument to think that the answer is yes, because what you'd be doing in that circumstance is trying to help your neighbor not to find the way to salvation. It's quite important, right? Is that like you're not trying to convert your neighbor through your execution of public authority. That's quite clear. That's just like not the job of the state.
So not mandating, not legislating morality.
Precisely. Precisely. You'd be trying to make sure the water is clean, right?
So it's sort of like the Constitution. What like a restrictionist to the Constitution would say, the function of government is to make the trains run on time, fill the potholes, not to legislate morality.
Precisely.
Help with the economy or the poor people or whatever.
That's exactly right. And that is the kind of thing that Luther is saying is the proper scope of secular authority.
And that's interesting to me because one of the things that we talked about in class too was he's not here to break the church in half. He wants to just reform it within, right? So this is not an attempt to make himself a revolutionary icon necessarily, right?
That's right. One of the great ironies of the, sort of the great reformers. We think of Luther, we think of John Calvin, we think of Zwingli. All three of these individuals did not see themselves as what we would call sectarians, right? They didn't see themselves as founding new religious orders. They saw themselves as purifying the one church. One of the great inheritances of the Reformation, and part of the reason for viewing a figure like Luther as a sort of pivotal figure in the history of political thought, in this hinge point in history, is one of the things that the Protestant Reformation is going to bequeath to the future of Europe is what we would call today sort of pluralism, this idea of we live in a society that is riven by, among other things, different kinds of disagreements about religion, about what the best kind of life is, how should we live. Today we tend to think, we're going to have to share our community with people who don't agree with us about these questions. And in Luther's day, that was absolutely not the case, emphatically not the case. For Luther himself, he would have believed a community is united in its faith. A community is united in its political authority. And to posit, well, we can just have two religions coexisting. Unthinkable.
Or class warfare.
I mean, class warfare was exactly one of the things that you needed to make sure did not occur.
And that leads me to, and I want to make sure we get to this, is with the Swabian peasants in Germany, they maybe see him as a reformer. You know, he points out this corruption in the church and the politicization of everything. So there's a problem for them in their homeland, and then they write to him asking him for approval or support. So what's happening to the Swabian peasants? What's their situation?
Yeah, so the Swabian peasants, so we're talking about Swabia is this area in sort of southern Germany, northern Switzerland, or what we would call today modern Switzerland, modern Germany. And this is this huge uprising. It's an enormous uprising of hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of peasants rise up. I mean, it doesn't begin. It begins with like, we've got some complaints. And so you've got many different communities begin this process by complaining about a variety of things. Things like I call them sort of taxes being too high, a common theme in history.
We've heard that before, yeah.
Yes, right. But also these other kind of feudal things. So they want the right to hunt and fish on common land.
And they can't do that.
They are not allowed to do that. This is exclusively the right of lords in the land. And they're like, we would like to do that too, please. The ability to cut down wood on the common lands, right, so they can warm their houses with it. Again, not allowed. Place to place. Another thing, and the kind of thing that they thought that Luther would support them in, was that they wanted to be able to appoint their own religious leaders. So their own preachers, their own pastors, priests.
Which would logically track, one would have thought, based on maybe on the surface of what he'd written.
Oh, Luther absolutely supports this type of thing in general. So they write to Luther hoping to have his support, right, in their uprising.
But they're mistaken.
Oh, they are very much mistaken. Yes, they are. Yes, they are.
I can't imagine getting that letter back, how disappointed I'd be. It's like being rejected for a job or a university, but like to the max.
Right.
It's your life.
It's your life. It's your family's life, right? So Luther responds to them saying, essentially, he has this, he does this, I think that's what we would call today a kind of both sidesism. He kind of says, well, look, the peasants are completely correct that their lords have been oppressing them. So they're
taking their money.
And they're really exploiting them quite. The lords are exploiting the peasants very thoroughly.
In a modern context, we would see this and go, well, that's just clearly wrong.
To exploit them the way that they were, absolutely. So they're complaining about wages falling, kinds of things that, again, are quite understandable to us today. Basically, one of the things that's happening in the background here is that the Black Death had sort of killed off a lot of the population of Europe, and ironically, after all of that mass death, it actually leads to times being pretty good in Europe because there's like a lot of land that's available.
Resources available.
And the peasant workforce is in much higher demand, because there aren't as many peasants around, and so lords are having to offer them higher wages.
It's good for business.
It's good for business. I mean, right now we're living in a period of very low unemployment, historically low unemployment in the United States, and this is allowing workers in our economy to demand higher wages, and they're getting them. And that was also the period for decades following the end of the Black Death, the recession of the Black Death. This is now coming to an end, and so wages are falling, and the rising standards of living were now starting to fall, and this is a huge part of what triggers the peasants' revolt. Anyway, so Luther responds to them saying, look, you're right, the lords are exploiting you and it's wrong, but you are wrong to rise up, because your obligation is to obey. That's what you're supposed to do.
This goes back to that root of obeying the temporal authority.
That's exactly right. He says, what you should do is pray. Pray for forgiveness. Not forgiveness. Well, I mean, yes, pray for forgiveness now that you've risen up. Yeah. But pray that God will save you. And that's it. That's what you should do. So he writes to the letter that he writes. It's called the friendly
admonition.
Friendly admonition to peace. Right. He writes this to the peasants, but he also writes it to the lords, because the parts of it that are speaking about the lords, he's wagging his finger at the lords as well. And holding them, so it is. That's why I say it's this both sidesism. Well, both the lords are wrong for oppressing you, and you are wrong for rising up against them. And as you say, today we might say, well, obviously rising up would be the appropriate thing to do in the circumstance, but Luther doesn't see it that way.
This would be more of, I know when I first read that, the first thing I thought of was like, this is like Karl Marx right here. This is sort of rise up, seize the means of production kind of thing. But Luther, I suppose, didn't see it that way. And so
he was not a social revolutionary. He might have wanted to revamp the theology of the church and some of its organizational elements, but he did not want a social revolution.
And so what happens to the peasants at that point? They just don't have any support from the church or of any kind.
That's
right?
a very polite way of putting it. Another way of putting it is that they are slaughtered wholesale. Although they command massive armies. There are pitched battles between the Swabian peasants and the sort of lords. And the lords are massively outnumbered, right? You'll have like armies that are tens of thousands strong. They have pitchforks and they have wooden staves, and the lords have swords and horses.
So you're just outnumbered completely.
100,000 peasants are put to death in the.
So that's sort of the punishment
repression.
for your crime, almost. Would you say that's fair? That it's like you're being punished. So the punishment for this opposition to church authority is temporal rejection physically. So attack.
I suppose. I suppose you could see it that way. Yeah, I'm not sure whether Luther would put it that way, but he certainly was not. I mean, mass bloodshed. He's not in favor of that, to be sure.
Yeah.
But he's also, as I said, not on board with their agenda of social reform.
And I want to also ask about so a normal everyday Christian, they are toiling about in the world. Just sort of so I understand his philosophy. Your job is not to have a bigger home, have more money. Your job is to toil, live, and then hopefully have lived well enough to been granted heaven after the fact, right?
Something like that. Yeah, sure, absolutely. This worldly concerns are distinctly, I mean, to call them secondaries they are practically irrelevant.
Isn't this a dark way of sort of interpreting Christianity, or is that, do you know what I'm saying? Is that sort of it seems doom and gloom. I don't think all Christian theologians would they would say your brother's keeper, help, everybody's equal, and I don't know, I guess I think of it in terms of Christianity taking a more positive spin. Is that just characteristic of the times that they lived in, or?
I mean, it is a choice that different reformers would make. So Luther is repudiating, among other things. You have the periodic reformers who are willing to say something like, well, the way that you get yourself to heaven is by acting in accordance with what the Bible tells you to do, which he would call works, right? By doing good works in the world, by helping your neighbor, by improving the world, as we might say, saving the world.
So he is doing that, just not in the modern context that we might.
Luther?
Yeah.
No, so Luther is so there are other reformers around who are taking one version or other of that position.
I see.
But he is emphatically not.
Yeah.
He is rejecting that kind of view with both hands. And here he's more in the sort of mainstream, I suppose, of Christian theology, going back to Augustine, right? So Augustine has this view that he's repudiating what's called Pelagianism, which is precisely the view that you can achieve salvation, essentially earn salvation, by doing the right kind of conduct on earth.
That's sort of my association with Christianity. I identify much more with that.
And that is heresy.
It is.
Heresy. One of the great heresies,
the pitchforks would be coming from.
Yes, they surely would. They surely would.
So put him in a modern context. So where do we see Martin Luther in modern Christianity? Is there any remnants of him? Do we see him anywhere?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the state-supported churches is the Lutheran Church in Germany, right? So, I mean, of course, in his homeland, he was the most influential and has had the longest kind of shadow, I suppose. But in terms of his theology, I mean, we definitely do see strains of evangelical Christianity here in the United States that really put, a genuine emphasis on the preaching of the Word and the distinct secondariness of all this worldly
almost
concerns.
Mennonite or something, maybe?
Maybe Mennonites, perhaps. I don't suppose that I don't think they might be insufficiently evangelical, perhaps.
I see.
I don't see too many Mennonites knocking on doors, I suppose.
Oh, I just think in terms of the separation, though. I mean, there's definitely that the religion comes first before temporal things.
Yes, although now one thing that's important to bear in mind about Luther is that although he is an essential theological figure, he is distinctly also concerned about the survival of his movement. So what am I talking about? When I say he's an opponent of social revolution, in part that's because he knows if he becomes an advocate of social revolution, his protection, which he has from
the physical danger,
it comes up.
Yeah,
it comes right back.
Yeah.
Because he wants to enjoy the favor of the powers that be, and the powers that be are those who are empowered by the current social arrangement of his day.
So it's like rebel and ask for reform, but don't go too far off the reservation because we might not be able to help you.
That's
you do.
Probably not an
unfair characterization.
That's probably not unfair, exactly. Yes, exactly.
So where do you think, in the final few minutes, where do you think Martin Luther ranks in terms of influencers upon Christianity across time? We talked about Jesus and Paul, obviously noteworthy to the early movement.
Yeah.
Where does he place up there with them and Augustine? Or?
So, in terms of his significance for Christians, probably not as marked as Paul or Augustine. You don't have as many people revisiting his works in the same way that you do. People read the Pauline letters all the time at weddings, right? So people aren't really.
Love is kind.
Yeah, and of course you do have some of his writings which will definitely leave a distinct. Pungency. So, for instance, his I think you have this work here, on the Jews and their lies. Later in his life, he really takes a very emphatically anti-Semitic, like even more anti-Semitic than the people of his day, who were distinctly anti-Semitic, which affects his reception these days.
Just because more.
Why was he especially anti-Semitic? I don't know.
That just sort
honestly.
of happened.
Yeah, it just exactly. He develops his thought in this way that leads him to take this like very distinctly anti-Semitic view. So his significance, ironically, I think, historically, is going to have a lot to do with the afterlife of the Protestant Reformation. As I was saying before, the reformers of their day were very much in favor of a uniform religious devotion within any given community. Yeah. But what they ironically bequeathed, were 200 years of religiously fueled war in Europe, which culminates in everybody saying, guys, we can't do this anymore. Let's just create a principle where you can do your religion in your place and I'll do mine in mine. And so you create, after the exhaustion of literally centuries of war, you have the emergence of tolerance, this idea that we will just not argue about religion at the highest levels of political contestation. We will take religious disagreements and we will make them not a thing that we argue about in politics.
It's like the Westphalian system.
The Westphalian system, part of the Westphalian system is premised upon, it's a rather long Latin phrase, but it basically means every prince will determine the religion within his principality, essentially. And that is precisely ending the question of there will be one religion and only one religion within any given.
It's the secularization of
and it's the shattering of Christendom. It's the creation of pluralism. And that pluralism is initially within Christendom, but eventually comes to be something that every political division has some Protestant churches and some Catholic churches, and then sects, and that comes to be a fact of the matter. And now eventually we have European states where 30%, 40% of the population are not religious at all.
And churches are now seen as historic structures.
Being turned into condos, right? That is part of Martin Luther's legacy.
I wonder what he would think of that.
Probably would not be very happy about it, I imagine.
Well, I appreciate you coming on the show. I love it. That was fascinating. I hope you'll come back and talk to us, but we're going to have to leave it right there.
Sounds great.
That was my guest, Dr. Kevin Elliott of Murray State University, discussing Martin Luther. We'll hope you'll join us next time.